Very good. Well, welcome everyone. We'll, like I said, we'll give everybody a few minutes to get in, get settled, and we'll kick everything off. So, have y'all started hitting any of the actual hot weather in Boston yet, or is it still pretty nice? And
Yeah, it was like in the 90s all week, actually. It was a heat wave. It was very, very hot here this week. Today and then this weekend it'll be a little calmer, but yeah, earlier this week it was pretty hot.
I don't even think it's in the 90s here in Atlanta. I mean, it's warm. Don't get me wrong. We've had a little bit of rain all week, so it hasn't been like tragically hot, but we're uh, we're right around a week or two away where it just gets to 90 plus degrees and 100% humidity, and you just stay hot the whole time. So, but that's part of it. I'm already in shorts and t-shirt weather, so it's going to be a while
Yeah,
before pants go back on.
absolutely. Absolutely. We got a nice little matching thing going on today. All good.
Perfect. It's almost like we planned it for everyone listening. We did
I
not.
wish I wish we could. I wish we could take credit.
I know, right? Oh, good stuff. Well, we have some more folks trickling in, but we'll get things kicked off. Obviously, we're recording, so we'll be able to share if anybody jumps in late. But Sean, excited to have you here, man. Especially for everyone just joining, especially if you're new to joining Shop Talk. First and foremost, we always want to thank all the folks that put in all the hard work to put this whole thing together, especially the marketing team behind the scenes here at Sonar, as well as our sponsors over at Salesforce for jumping in and really helping us get the word out about how do we continue to elevate the entire operations community. So, like I said, as always, we're happy to have them as our partners, and especially having everyone here, to join. So that being said, we'll kick right in. This topic today, I'm actually really excited about. Your keys to align our tech stack. Sean, you and I have talked extensively, numerous times about tech stack. How do we do it? What do we do? When do we do it? Is the big thing. And so before we get too far into that, obviously I want to let you introduce yourself. Tell us who you are, what you do, and we'll keep rolling from there.
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. It's good to chat with you anytime. My name's Sean Lane. I'm the Director of Operations at Drift. We're a revenue acceleration platform based out of Boston, but we have offices all over the country and customers all over the world. And right now I focus on both our sales operations and customer success operations teams within Drift. So kind of across that go-to-market spectrum, and super excited to be here to chat about tech stacks with you, Brad. I'm also a very, very happy member of the WizOps community. It's been an amazing resource for me over the last couple of years. And so hopefully the folks that are here are getting just as much out of it as I do.
Absolutely. Well, one of the things too, I always have to call this out. Sean was one of the very early wizards in WizOps, and even one of the first times that I met Sean was well before we started Sonar, working in RevOps. I was director of RevOps at Terminus. Sean was still at Drift, and I remember we just got connected via Marco. I believe it was Marco that put us together, and just jamming out on all things RevOps. I think we're both. I had just gone through an acquisition with Bright Funnel and Terminus. I think y'all were just starting to go down the acquisition route. So when we think about that story, it's one of the true and genuine ways that wizards are helping each other. We had another RevOps guy, Marco, who obviously has a ton of RevOps knowledge and thought leadership on. It's like, hey, you guys need to jam out on this. You've been there, Brad. Sean's walking that mile now. So at its core, that's exactly what WizOps is for, is, operations folks learning from each other, embracing each other, helping along the way, which is exactly what we'll do today. Diving into the topic of aligning our tech stacks. There's a lot to unpack here. I know we talk so often about go-to-market technologies, but I think one of the cool things about this episode and what we're going to unpack is a lot of the things when you think about the growth of it. We don't sit in a static state of what our operations team looks like, and even from a headcount perspective, but also from a technology perspective. And so there's a lot of reasons why we should really start to think about building our tech stack at the right time for the right people. And a lot of that comes down to what I'm about to steal Sean's thunder is process, people, and tech. But we'll start there because a lot of this has to align to the customer journey as well. So we'll start with this very first topic. Sean, how can documenting your customer journey without technology, i.e. on paper, help you when you start to introduce technology into the process?
Yeah, I mean, I think the most important thing you just said about that is without the technology, right? So where I typically do for my own tech stack inside of Drift and for my own customer journey, and what I encourage other folks to do as well, is start by looking at that entire customer journey. Can you start at the very top of the funnel, looking at, we're at the beginning of that prospecting process, through the opportunity, through when that person might become a customer, through when you ultimately have to service and support that customer, and look across that entire customer journey, understand where the handoffs are, where the inefficiencies are probably going to be created, which different teams and which different roles within your organization are probably going to play a part in that customer journey, and start there, right? And don't worry about what tech's going to support each point, but just understand the levers you have available to you, the conversion points that are going to be necessary, and then also where the points of friction might be. And usually where those points of friction are, or where those handoffs might be, those are a good place to start looking at where there might be some inefficiencies and opportunities for technology. And so by starting that process, by writing everything down with your peers and thinking about what you might be able to enhance through technology, that's always where I like to start. And by the way, like, if you haven't been able to articulate that in a manual process, then chances are you might not know the problem that technology is actually going to solve for you, right? And so, like, feeling that pain from the manual version is a great place to start.
Absolutely. And we hear this often. You as a thought leader in this space, I'm sure people come to you so often like, hey, should I buy this or should I buy that? We get these questions all the time, both on the Sonar team. We see it all the time in WizOps when we evaluate software. And the thing to keep in mind there is find out if you have a problem first. Like, I think so many times, I hate to say this, like, so many companies will have this misconception of, well, other companies are doing it. We need to adopt that piece of software. So you start to go down these routes of like, ooh, should I go with SalesLoft or Outreach? Should I go with this or should I go with that? Should I go with Marketo versus HubSpot? Like, you tell me. It's like, what are you trying to solve? Like, find a pain point first. And I think too often, again, and this is coming from a guy who sells software, right? Don't want to totally hurt us. The same thing, Drift being a software company, but you're not doing yourself and your team any favors, and you're certainly not doing the vendor any favors if you truly don't have a pain point you're trying to solve with it. So you're spot on. Analyze those problems first. And the one thing too, I should have mentioned this right before we kicked off. Obviously, everyone on here, we want to hear from you. If you have questions along the way, drop them into the chat. I'm actually about to launch a poll right now. It's very simple, yes, no. Are you using technology to manage your customer journey? I've got a sneaking suspicion that the majority of folks, especially RevOps leaders and SalesOps leaders and folks here, are going to be answering with a nice yes. But actually, we have a no right now. So I'm super curious. And obviously, with the no, that first bit of advice in this first question of, find those pain points first, that's gonna speak to you. I'm sure you've got some. That's what our community's for. That's what Sean and I are here for. So again, ask the questions as we roll, but we'll keep the ball rolling as well. So moving into this next question, and this is one of those things that you got to be very cautious of because you want to be efficient. But how do you go about delegating, driving technology and driving enablement with your organization?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think first you kind of have to split those things up a little bit, right? First with the technology itself, and then second with the enablement. So on the technology, the way we actually think about the buckets of work that our operations team does at Drift, and also how we divide up the personnel, is kind of in three different buckets. We think of it as planning, execution, and reporting. And so you can imagine that depending on which of those buckets you might fall into, the tools you use are probably going to be a little different for what your area of focus is. So for example, if you work on sales ops execution, then tools like you mentioned around Outreach or Drift or Clary, those are probably going to be tools that might fall into your spectrum. And so what we try to do from an ops team perspective is put ourselves in the shoes of the reps that we are trying to enable. So we have folks that focus on the day in the life of a sales rep at Drift. And so anybody who is focused on the day in the life of a sales rep at Drift should own the tool that rep actually has to use, right? Because they're going to be the closest to their use cases. They're going to be the closest to their workflow. And so it's really important for us that we know exactly what those workflows look like. And then we're designing the tech stack to fit into those workflows, as opposed to starting with the tech and then figuring out the workflow later. I think working within your rep's existing workflows is a great way to do that. And then to your second question about enablement, again, I think about enablement a little bit differently depending on what it is you're talking about. So I think that there's like sales skill enablement, and there's technology and process enablement, right? And so we have a separate sales productivity team at Drift that's amazing, that teaches them about sales skills and how to command the message, right? And believe me, you do not want me teaching the team those sales skills, right? If I'm the guy teaching them, we have a much bigger problem as a company. But what my team and what I can help with is on the technology and the process enablement, right? Again, how does it fit into your day? How does it fit into your workflow? And we can talk more about this, Brad, but I think the most effective way to get that enablement across is figuring out what's the why for your audience, right? Why is this actually going to be beneficial to the folks that you're asking to use this tool, as opposed to why is this beneficial for me as the ops guy behind the scenes?
Yeah, we bring up a really good point. We'll kind of double click into it for a second. There is a big difference between sales enablement and technology enablement. And the one thing, if there's a silver line to all of it, is that the fact that we now have dedicated people and resources in enablement is amazing. Like, enablement hasn't been this long-term title that you've seen floating around on LinkedIn or within organizations for a while. Do y'all have, just a candid question, I know your team well enough, so this is a little rhetorical, but do you have dedicated people, like an actual person that is doing just tech enablement, like you said, and just sales enablement, right?
So we do have folks who are just doing sales enablement, right? And their focus is on the productivity of the sales team. On the tech enablement side, that's kind of within our broader ops team, right? And so similar, going back to those buckets that I mentioned, if you are the person who's focused on sales execution and there are tools that lend themselves to that bucket of work, then you need to be the person who's also really good on that enablement side. And ultimately, you're probably also going to be the one who helps frame the content for that, both for new reps as well as when we launch stuff in the first place. Having someone who really owns that and understands the rep's perspective on it is really helpful, because at my last company, our CEO used to call it the 747 problem. You had all these like really expensive tools sitting on the runway and nobody knew how to fly them, right? And so you have to have people who really understand how these tools work and how they fit into that customer journey we were talking about at the beginning.
Absolutely. Well, I think, so the two things I'll unpack there is, one, having somebody that, and you mentioned this kind of in a previous statement, where it's having somebody that's so familiar with those processes because they work day in, day out with that. If you don't have a certain level of empathy, and it's really going to do kind of damage to your company. If you're the my way is the highway type person, you're going to struggle in this role. And I think what we've seen, and especially I ask everyone from our customer perspective as well as in the community, how'd you get here? There's not that many, to my knowledge, there's not an operations degree that you go and get from somewhere, or a Salesforce degree for that matter. A lot of, obviously certifications you can get. But how'd you get here? And the coolest answer, I was an SDR. And then, I fell in love with how I saw the technology helping me. And I just got so much more ingrained in the tech side of it. So I wanted to go that way. And I think those are the ops leaders, candidly speaking, that I feel like show the most level of empathy, that they just get so into it. Like, man, I'm not going to go build this cumbersome process that I wouldn't want to follow if I was still doing that job. So why would I think about that? So it's just a really good point. Like, always, we tell our sales team, sell with empathy. Like, we push them so hard. Like, you have to understand the mile that most of the folks on the other end of that Zoom call have walked, and understand what they do. And I think it's just important too, internally, when you're thinking of operations folks, like, you're a seller too. You're selling a new process, a new technology to your go-to-market team. I mean, marketing, sales, customer success, whatever it is. You got to be pretty savvy in that, but you also have to be able to walk that mile and do it empathetically. So,
the street cred of having done those jobs is totally real.
Oh my gosh, yeah, absolutely it is. It's just such an easy line too. It's like you're having that conversation with your team. And I remember when this was a pain for me back when I was doing it. So that's why I'm trying to solve for it. And it's like, man, you de-risk it, kind of put somebody on their heels a little bit. It's so good. Kind of going into some of this technology side of it, and I know I'm going to de-risk this, or I'm going to just kind of call a spade here. If you jumped on this call to hear advice from Sean or from me to say, you should really buy this product, that's probably not what you're going to get at this call. We're going to give you very directional advice on how to build your team and your tech around it. But it's a tough question to answer without throwing too many logos out. So if we throw one out, it's good. But different technology is useful at different stages in the funnel, as well as different stages in a company's growth state, right? Where Drift was 3 years ago, 2 years ago, even a year ago, is drastically different than where you are now. what tips do you have for finding technology that fits a company and the current stage they're in?
Yeah. So I think the point you made about the maturity of the company is a really important one. There's a graph that we show to a lot of new hires at Drift, and we're trying to teach them about sales and marketing funnels, where we look at companies where it's basically the maturity of the company in terms of size and age on one axis versus the maturity of the company in terms of the metrics and the complexity of what they look at on one axis on the other. And a question I get all the time is like, is it possible to be a really big company but be really immature when it comes to what you measure? And the answer is absolutely yes. And then in the inverse, like you can be a really small company, but be incredibly mature in terms of what your tech stack and what you measure looks like, right? And so one, like try to plot your company on that map, right? Of where you are from a maturity perspective. And then what are the needs of the organization, right? So a couple examples of categories that maybe when you're smaller, like you might not need like this amazing ABM solution, or you might not need this, perfect forecasting tool. But if you're particularly focused on top of funnel, then maybe you do need a prospecting tool like an outreach or sales ops that you were mentioning before. Or maybe you haven't really built out your database yet and you need a lot of help on the enrichment front. And so maybe you are looking at some of the tools that are going to help you to enrich the information available so you can figure out what your target accounts are, right? And so what I typically have done, at least in my journey at Drift, is we've actually worked our way kind of down the funnel as we've gotten more mature, right? So a lot of what you might need at the top of the funnel to build that inbound engine is where your tools and areas of focus might be. And then as you get a little bit more mature, then you can start to say, okay, I'm less concerned about my, lead to meeting conversion rate. And now I'm more concerned about my opportunity win rate, right? And what are the tools or what are the systems that might help us improve our win rate? And so you have to just figure out what levers are the most important for you and for your business. One of the things that we talk about a lot when we're selling Drift and we're coaching our reps on and talking to our customers is like, why is this a problem for you now? Why is Drift the right thing to help solve that problem for you? And then what is it that you're actually trying to change, right? And so if you're on the buying side of that equation, I would ask you the exact same questions, right? Remove Drift from the equation. Why is now the moment in time? What are you trying to change? And then when you do pick a vendor, why is that vendor the right one to solve that problem for you? And so asking questions like that as you're going through the process, I think one will keep you a little bit more disciplined, and hopefully two, you'll avoid what Brad and I have talked about a bunch of times, just like this like tech stack bloat, where every time somebody thinks they have a problem, they run off and buy a new tool to try and solve it. So there's a lot there, but ultimately, if you can fit that into your larger company progression and that larger customer journey that we talked about at the beginning, that's usually a good recipe for success.
Absolutely. And I'm going to tee you up for another question real quick. And obviously, like we catch up before these, kind of throw them out here, but I haven't really thrown this one to Sean. So I'm going to catch them off guard a little bit. I'm going to have a little bit of thought to it. But we talk about, you and I have talked about this before on your podcast, which for anybody that has not listened to Sean's podcast Operations, go find it. Probably one of the best value adds that I have all the time. But how do we get to tech stack bloat? Well, sometimes it's because we have misaligned buying committees. There are times, and everyone in the operations world, especially on this call, stop me if you heard this one. VP of sales or VP of marketing comes over to you as the operations person who owns the tech stack, says, hey, I just bought XYZ system. Are you good to go ahead and install that next week and get it up and running? And you as an operations person, you're like, no, like, why do we have talked about this before you bought it? I want to make sure you bought the right stuff. And so I'm going to tee you up on that one to think about buying committees. How do you go and formulate this inside? But I'll also give you just sort of a high five on this. Again, it reiterates back to some of our first points, like make sure you understand the customer journey first. Like, what are you trying to solve for? Buying software in these stages of life, especially stages of a company's life, are totally different. You can be a Series B company and still be less than 100 employees. You can be a Series A company and be 200 employees. And not that employee count is what should drive how you go about doing technology and how you look for efficiencies, but it just goes to show that every company is different. Some problems, they might be very mature in a really young company, but they're mature enough in their technology savviness that they're already employing some of these great products. So you nailed it on that one as far as just understand what the problem is and really think of the customer journey too. But I'll ask that question again. I'll reiterate it when you think about the buying committee and how you go about buying software. Also, obviously, my call out to everybody here still on. Please feel free to drop a question. Frank, you just drop one in, so I'm gonna read it right now, and we'll queue it up. But yeah, when you think of your buying committee, especially at Drift, how do you go about?
Yeah, it's such a good question. So one of the things that I really like about those categories I mentioned before of planning, execution, and reporting is we've had to stress test those a little bit with scenarios like this, right? So for example, if someone in marketing wants to buy a particular tool for a particular part of the customer journey, what helps us there is then we have to think about how that's going to impact kind of each of those buckets that I mentioned and each of the customer facing teams that might either like kind of downstream be impacted by that purchase. And so I'm guessing that folks that are on this call and are listening to this recording, like everyone has a slightly different org structure within their team. And like some people are big fans of a centralized team, like a RevOps team. Some people feel like they're siloed in different parts. And honestly, what I've come to believe about buying technology or just how ops teams are structured in general is regardless of who you report to or regardless of what the structure of the team is, as long as you've kind of instilled this belief within everyone who works in ops that you have to care about what happens in the other parts of the customer journey that you're not responsible for, that's the absolute best way to avoid those like weird buying committee things or that tech stack bloat, right? If I am working in marketing ops and I care what happens in the sales ops or the customer success ops part of the funnel, and I don't just swat this problem away from my face and not care about the ripple effects of that, then you're going to be in a better spot. And I think that is totally true regardless of what the company's org structure or reporting structure is.
Yeah, you're spot on. And what I find, and look, you talk to so many of the same folks that I talk to, especially in the circles that we're in WizOps and in the greater operations community. Every org is structured different, and so there's not going to be necessarily a formula to use here, or like here's your prescription. You should go through this buying cycle and have this buying committee, and this person sits at the top, and these three people vote. It's not as as binary as that or as crystal clear as that. But I think you bring up a really good point. If you're truly wanting to help the company and organization, and again, you're in marketing ops, but you want to make sure whatever decision you're making, even within a silo or a collective group, how is that going to impact the rest of this organization? Because if you're not thinking about that, you are going to end up in tech stack bloat, and you're going to end up playing this game of Jenga that we always talk about. And so it's tough, but always think of how it's going to impact everybody else and just be very cognizant of that. So this question we're going to answer live. So Frank, thanks for asking it. You talk about the 747 problem. How do you start fixing that 747 problem when you're new to a company and you just inherited this parking lot of 747s?
Such a good question. Thanks, Frank. So the first thing that I would do is, my guess is if you've inherited somebody else's mess, as you said in the question, chances are you probably don't have phenomenal documentation that was handed off to you. And so the first thing I would do is go back to what we said right at the beginning of this conversation is like, and you're going to have to map that whole thing out yourself, right? And you're going to have to map out where this 747 fits into the customer journey. And then you're going to probably have to make the hard decision of whether or not it should be in there or not. And if it is, then your job at that point is to become an expert in how it does fit into the customer journey and how folks who are in those customer facing roles or just folks in your entire organization in general might be able to leverage that to make their lives easier or make their jobs easier. But ultimately, I think if you start with the documentation, figure out where it fits in, make an go, no go decision about whether it sticks around, and then you become the expert. That to me is the right order of operations when you're coming in cold.
I agree. Just think so objectively about it. And I'm going to stay objective over here, but I'm also going to talk about subjectivity because this is tough, right? If you've inherited a tech stack, and believe it or not, a lot of folks we talking to a current customer of ours, I'll leave them anonymous for now, but they were hired to help come in and clean up this inherited tech stack. They had this issue where just tech was flying everywhere. They got the bloat. They just had buyers everywhere. VP of sales buys a million things. CFO was buying stuff they didn't need. And when that happens, and this is what happens especially when executives buy software, there's a bias there. There's a reason they bought it. They might have a relationship there. They might have bought it a long time ago. The pain point's not there anymore, but they like the product, they like the team there, and so they just kept it. If there's anything I could suggest, work on removing any of that bias and just think so objectively. It goes back to your point, Sean. Document all of it. What pain points are we actually solving? If it's not solving something and you do the right analytics, you document it the right way, and you take that back to the rest of the business, like, hey guys, I know this software is great on paper. It helped us out a long time ago. I don't think it's solving the problems that we're solving now. And here's why. They have to come up with a really good rationale to keep it, other than I really like the sales rep, but they were really good to me. I got a shirt from them that was cool. Like, you have to just think objectively.
I think too, Brad, just to add on to that, I think a dangerous assumption maybe that you and I are making is that you as the operator are involved in that process to begin with, right? And so that's the first thing. If you as your operations team are not a key part of that buying decision-making process, that's the first thing, is inserting yourself and making sure that you're a strategic partner in each of those purchases. Because like, I've heard and experienced firsthand plenty of times can you just come on this call and make sure that this thing integrates with Salesforce? They said the implementation takes 5 minutes and that'll be fine, right? And in reality, there's so much more consideration that needs to take place there, not just for the purchase, but then for the ongoing maintenance and upkeep and design of how that's going to fit into the rest of your tech stack. So I think we should probably make sure that before we get into any of the documentation or anything else that we mentioned today, like, we as ops have to be a strategic partner in that process. And, you know, that's an earned thing, right? It's easy to say you want to be a strategic partner, but you have to make sure that you have set yourself up and provided value to be in that process.
Absolutely. And I tell folks often too, like, the biggest superpower you're going to have is showing that objectivity and making sure that what you're doing is for the greater good of the company. It has nothing to do with, I'm going to go scratch somebody's back and say, scratch it for me earlier. Like you have to be that partner, that trusted resource. Like, you know, we know they're going to come in and objectively evaluate the software and make it the right thing. I did think of, and we're going to write this down, it's probably going to be our next conversation, whichever we do, either on here or on your podcast, because there's a whole thought here too, and we see this happen often. Executives move around in different companies all the time, and even at that executive power, sometimes, like, hey, I'm a CMO. Here's my playbook. Here's my tech stack. I know we're using something different here. I'm going to come in, I'm going to flip the table upside down, and we're going to overhaul this thing because this is my prescription. There's probably so much to unpack there. I'm going to give the tease there for other folks that want to stay or join one of the next shop talk or your podcast too. So
I love it. But that could be a whole thing on its own.
It really could. I know we're getting close on top of time, so we're going to toss a couple of rapid fire questions out there. If there are any last minute questions from the audience, please drop them in. But some of these are ops focused, some of them aren't, because it's the fun part about getting to know the humans on the other side of these screens. Biggest question I got for you right now: what's the hottest thing you're watching right now on Netflix, Hulu, TV? What you got?
So I'll tell you, like, my guilty pleasure right now is Below Deck Sailing Yacht. Unbelievable program. Unbelievable. And then I would say, like, the real show on Netflix, I'm late to the game, but Peaky Blinders on Netflix I really like too.
Interesting. I started Peaky Blinders and we just kind of fell off on it, which I'm terrible at. Like, if I don't get enough of a fix in the first like 2 or 3 episodes, I'm probably going to pitch it. And I've kind of heard that, like, you got to stick with it and let it build.
Yeah.
Now, I will say, total fanboy to the hill for Below Deck, both sailing yacht and the normal Below Deck, like motor yacht.
It's so
the
good.
yachty life. I don't wish I could ever go back in time and rewind the clock and go into the yachty life, because I don't think I'd actually make it. But it's fascinating to me what lifestyle these people live. So I'm right there with you on that. This is a loaded question. I'm going to let you answer because I'm going to answer too. Favorite podcast? I'm going to say Operations because it objectively is my favorite podcast. But anything else that you're getting value from on the podcast side of things?
It's very nice of you. So, like, I listen to a lot of non-business podcasts too. So I love Conan O'Brien's podcast. Conan O'Brien Needs a Friend is one of my, like, kind of go-tos on the non-business side of things. And then more on the business side of things, you know, my CEO's podcast, Seeking Wisdom, you know, still for me is an awesome one. They just did an awesome episode with a couple guys who wrote a book from Amazon called Working Backwards. And that was probably one of the best episodes I've listened to in a while.
Oh, so good. I'm going to have to listen to that one. I've listened to it one time. I need to listen to more of them now you say that. All right, final question, because I know we're at the top, and I know some folks are probably gonna have to jump to get to the next call, but we always like to forward think and pay it forward from an operations perspective. So, if you could roll back the clock, fire up the DeLorean, and you're at the very start of your operations career, what advice would you give yourself? If you were, like I said, to rewind the clock and say, if I could do things differently, or if I could focus in a different way, what advice would you give yourself in your operations career?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Honestly, I think it ties in well with what you guys are doing with WizOps, and I think my advice would be to seek out role models, right? I think for me at least, and maybe I'm the only one who's guilty of this, but like I feel like earlier in my career, I thought of it as a point of weakness to not know something and to not know the answer. And so you almost kind of pretend like you do know the answer when you don't really. And so one of the things that I've learned in my 3.5 years at Drift is like, it's okay to not know those answers, but it's not okay to sit on that, right? Going out and seeking out role models and finding people who have been there, done that, who have gone through a similar motion to you. Most of the problems we come across as operators have already been solved by somebody else, right? And so finding the people who have already gone through the pain so you can skip that pain yourself. That's the best advice that I would give myself. And, that's why we started the podcast in the first place. It's just a selfish way for me to learn at the end of the day.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. I sit here and scroll through WizOps all the time looking for nuggets of how we can do better. I listen to your podcast all the time just to figure out how I can do better as an operations pro. And I think you're right. Be humble, show some humility, ask a ton of questions. Because the more that you do that, there's two things you're going to find. You're going to find answers a lot faster and easier, but you're also just going to find that this operations role and the persona behind the screen is so willing to help and roll their sleeves up and dive into it. We've all had that lonely island feeling, like we're an island of one or an army of one. And we all seek that same validation of like, am I thinking about this the right way? So you're spot on. Seek advice, find a mentor, spot on. So,
and operations people are so generous, right? Like it's amazing the answers you get when you post a question in WizOps and how many people jump in to share their opinion or share their experience, right? It's not like sales where we can look to our left and look to our right and there's 10 other people doing the exact same job as us, right? We have to go outside the four walls of our company to find these folks.
You're so right. It is. It's again, it's one of those things. Everybody's willing to pay it forward, but the biggest thing you have to do is take that first step and ask. So you're spot on. I know we're a few minutes over. Thanks for everybody hanging with us. Sean, thanks for hanging out with me. This is fun. Every time I hang out with you, I get smarter. So thank you for being on.
Very much appreciate you guys having me. It's been really fun.
Absolutely. Well, again, we'll be back in a couple of weeks for another episode. Sean, again, thank you. Have a great rest of your day, and we'll talk soon, all right?
All right. Thanks, everybody.
See ya.